All right, welcome everybody. I want to provide everyone with an introduction to this book talk series first, and then that'll be followed up by an introduction for today's speaker, and then our presentation. My name is Brian J. Griffith. I am the host for today's virtual book talk event. Just as a little bit of biography for who I am the inaugural Eugen and Jacqueline Weber postdoctoral scholar in European history at UC Los Angeles. And this book talk is the second in a series of book talks that I'm hosting in conjunction with a course that I'm currently teaching here at UCLA titled Interwar Crisis, Europe 1918 to 1939. So our next virtual book talk, the third in the series, will be on Wednesday, May 19th from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And we'll focus on Claudio Fogu's recently published monograph, The Fishing Net and the Spiderweb, Mediterranean Imaginaries and the Making of Italians. If you'd like to see the list of the remaining book talks in the series, you'll have to take a look at the book talks subpage on my course website, which you can see here in the chat dialogue. And there's also registration portals available there for anyone who'd like to register for the two remaining book talks. I'd also like to acknowledge this series' co-sponsors, which are UCLA's Center for European and Russian Studies, which can be found on Twitter and Facebook under the handle UCLA-CERS, UCLA-CERS. Also UCLA's Department of Slavic, Eastern European and Eurasian Languages and Cultures, and finally, UCLA's Russian Flagship Program and UCLA's program on Central Asia. So we're very happy to have all of these entities at UCLA on board for this particular meeting. A few words here on the meeting format and procedures. So I'm going to begin by providing an introduction for today's speaker, which of course will be Dr. Stephen V. Bittner, and that'll be followed by a 30-minute presentation by Dr. Bittner on his recently published book, Whites and Reds. After Dr. Bittner's presentation, we'll have time, probably about 20 to 30 minutes, for some Q&A from the audience. If you're joining us here on Zoom, in fact, that's the only place you can join us on Zoom right now because Facebook Live is not functioning at the moment for me, please feel free to use the chat dialogue to submit your questions and or comments during the presentation or after. I will be taking them in the order in which that they're submitted in that location. And I just want to say, if you submit an entire question in the chat dialogue, I will read that as your indication that you'd like me to read it on your behalf. If you would like to ask your question yourself and have your video appear, then you can just indicate your desire to be next in line and I'll call on you in that order. Finally, as a courtesy to our speaker, as well as to the other attendees, I'd like to kindly request that you mute your microphones until it is your turn to speak, just so we can minimize any background noise during the presentation. All right, so onward to Dr. Bittner's introduction. So it is my pleasure, truly my pleasure, to introduce you to Dr. Stephen V. Bittner. So Dr. Bittner is a social, cultural, and political historian of Russia and the Soviet Union. Steve earned his doctorate in Russian and Soviet and Eastern European history at the University of Chicago in 2000, and shortly thereafter served as a research fellow at the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies in Washington, DC. And I believe it was simultaneously that he was serving as a visiting professor at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. Dr. Bittner is currently a professor of modern European history at Sonoma State University, which of course is my alma mater. Steve has been the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including from the Social Science Research Council, the National Endowment for the Humanities, which he won twice, the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research, the International Research and Exchanges Board, and the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies, again, 2 times. Dr. Bittner's research has appeared in many prestigious journals and edited volumes, too numerous to name here, but I do want to mention the 3 edited volumes and monographs that he has published over the years. So he is the author of Dmitry Shapilov's, am I pronouncing that correctly? Shapilov, thank you. Yeah. His translated and edited memoir, published by Yale University Press in 2007, and that is titled The Kremlin's Scholar. That was followed by The Many Lives of Khrushchev's Thaw, published by Cornell University Press the following year in 2008. And most recently, and the subject, of course, of today's virtual book talk is Whites and Reds, A History of Wine in the Lands of Tsar and Commissar, published by Oxford University Press just this year, the month before last. I believe it was March 2021. And if you haven't already purchased a copy of his most recent book, I would like to share with you the link to Oxford University Press's website. And I also need to link to this discount code, which will get you a 30% off discount at the point of purchase if you're interested in doing that today. Dr. Bittner has a couple of different projects currently underway as well that will be the follow-up projects to Whites and Reds, which includes a history of the Soviet presence in Antarctica, which is really an interesting topic for me, and an investigation of the various locations where refugees from Bolshevism encountered refugees from Nazism. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen V. Bittner.
Thanks, Brian. That was a very kind introduction. You smoothed over all the unpleasant parts, which I appreciate. So I'm going to spotlight myself. It doesn't look like I can do that, but Brian, maybe you can spotlight me. So I just want to start by saying that, I'm doubly proud today because this is really the first time I've talked about a new book as a new book, not as a project in process. But also, as you probably gathered from Brian's introduction, Brian was once one of my students. And I was thinking this morning, I remember telling Brian at some point that he had figured me out. He had figured out how to get an A in my class. And so probably it was time for him to look for bigger ponds. And obviously you're in a very big pond right now at UCLA. So I want to start today with a story, and then I'll work my way around the story through the remainder of my talk. So the story begins in 1919 amid the chaos of the Russian Civil War. And in 1919, a group of bandits arrived at a winery outside of Novorossiysk in the hills not far from the Black Sea. And according to published accounts, the bandits were greeted graciously and perhaps naively by the winery's chief vintner. But obviously the bandits had not come for friendly conversation. When the vintner refused to hand over the keys to the wine cellar, the bandits threatened to shoot. The vintner escaped death by hiding in an empty wine barrel. The wine in the cellar, which dated as far back as 1870, was not so lucky. And this story has a number of hidden meanings, which I'll draw out in a series of thematic and chronological arcs around that day in 1919. And I'll start with the most narrow arc, the arc closest to the events at hand, the individual. So the unfortunate vintner who barely escaped with his life on that day in 1919 was Anton Frolov Bagreyev. And Frolov Bagreyev in 1919 was already a giant in the world of Russian winemaking. He was born of wealth and privilege in Siberia, where his father was the chief representative of the Ministry of State Property. He had studied viniculture and winemaking as a young man in Madeira and Bordeaux. And like many people in late Tsarist Russia, many young people, Frolov Bagreyev had dabbled in progressive politics. He lost his job at the winery, albeit only temporarily, for speaking at a meeting of revolutionary-minded employees in 1905. And in the years before 1917, Frolov Bagreyev's sparkling wines were among the most coveted labels in all of Russia. And for this achievement, Nicholas II awarded him the orders of Saints Anna and Stanislav. 30 years later, Frolov Bagreyev would receive the Stalin Prize for devising a technology that mechanized the notoriously tricky process of champagne production. So Frolov Bagreyev is thus among a very small cohort of people, and in fact, he might be the only person formally commended with the highest awards of both the Tsarist and Soviet states. But Frolov Bagreyev is important for another reason as well. He was emblematic of a certain social type in the late Tsarist and early Soviet wine industries. And as his background suggests, the wine industry was not exactly a bastion of communist sympathy. During the late Tsarist years, it was dominated by aristocrats and foreigners. It was notable for its disparagement of popular taste and its genuflection to French expertise. Ambitious commercial vintners cut their teeth by training abroad. They were children of privilege, aristocrats, university graduates, and scientists. After October 1917, some of these persons chose emigration over the likelihood of persecution in the Soviet Union. The heirs of Lev Golitsyn, late Tsarist Russia's most famous vintner, left the family estate in Crimea for France in 1920. And for good reason. Friends, family members, and domestic staff persons who stayed behind in Crimea were ordered by the new Bolshevik government to appear for registration. One of them was shot. He was a chamberlain to the royal family and the son of a vinicultural inspector. Andrei Chelashev, whose father had been chief justice in the Russian imperial court, nearly died on a battlefield in Crimea in 1921. In emigration, Chelashev lit at Beaulieu vineyards in Napa, where he became known as the maestro for his sublime Cabernet Sauvignons. Later in life, Chelashev would form a close friendship with California's most famous anti-communist, Ronald Reagan. Yet far more common in the wine industry were people who sought a modus vivendi with Soviet power, despite their own less than impeccable revolutionary credentials. Vasily Tairov, late Tsarist Russia's most famous vinicultural scientist, remained at the experimental vineyard near Odessa that bore his name, even though he had extensive connections to the highest levels of the Tsarist state. In 1926, he was fired and his vineyard was renamed for the evolutionary botanist Clement Timiryazev. Georgy Gogolyanovsky, who was the author of an influential guidebook to viniculture and winemaking, survived until 1931 or 32, when he disappeared in the camps. He was an early victim of Trofim Lysenko. Mikhail Sherbakov, who was the director of the Nikitsky Botanical Garden in Yalta, did not have any revolutionary resume prior to 1917. Except for a university friendship with Alexander Ulyanov, Lenin's older brother, who was executed for participating in a plot to kill the Tsar. When the Tsarist general in charge of Yalta visited the botanical garden in 1910, he saw a photograph of Ulyanov on a side table. "And who do we have here?" the general asked. Without hesitating, Sherbakov answered, "That is my university comrade, Alexander Ulyanov. But I have an even better photograph of you, General." After 1917, Sherbakov found work at a winery in the Kuban, and then at an enological laboratory in Moscow. So despite backgrounds of bourgeois or even aristocratic privilege, all of these persons and many others sought common cause over wine with Soviet power. They lobbied early Soviet officials, even Lenin himself, to regulate the wine trade and to protect producers from unscrupulous merchants, even those merchants who worked for the Soviet state and who wore the leather trench coats of Bolshevism. In 1936, when Stalin embraced champagne as part of the good life of socialism, as a crucial vessel of Soviet kulturnist, and that word probably requires a little bit of explanation. It means appropriately cultured in Stalinist jargon. So these Tsarist holdovers got their wish in Stalin. Wine was important enough to regulate and promote. even though Stalinism would spell, or already had spelled, the destruction of so many of them. And there's far more to this story than continuity in the civilizing process across the revolutionary caesura. These persons of former privilege, wine cosmopolitans through and through, were almost unanimously opposed to the freewheeling capitalist ethos of NEP. Wine, in their view, was too important to leave to the chaos of the free market. So we might think of them as a highly unusual, non-communist opposition to NEP, joined paradoxically in their disdain for Lenin's strategic retreat with the Trotskyists and the trade unions, the militant Komsomol members who badgered the professoriate, and of course, eventually with the Stalinists and the Politburo, who vanquished the last defenders of NEP in February 1929. So wine made for very strange bedfellows during that first Soviet decade. So I want now to draw a slightly wider arc from that moment in 1919 when Frolov Bagreyev barely escaped with his life. The winery that the bandits ransacked was called Abraudorsu. It was a crown estate, meaning its revenues went directly to the upkeep of the royal family. In addition to Abraudorsu, there were several crown estates across the southern frontier: Massandra, Aidanil, Livadia, and Sudak in Crimea, Dagamis near Sochi, and Sinandali on the Kakhetian Plain in eastern Georgia. In 1912, Novi Sviat in Crimea became a crown estate when it passed from the Golitsins to the Romanovs by virtue of an unusual bankruptcy arrangement, where the winery's tax arrears were forgiven in return for title to about half the estate. On one of these crown estates, Livadia, Nicholas II maintained a residence. You see it here. That palace would famously host the Yalta Conference in February 1945. Now, Abraudorsu traced its origins to Grand Prince Mikhail Nikolaevich, who was the youngest son of Nicholas I and the Governor General of the Caucasus during the 1860s and 70s. The region surrounding Abraudorsu was notable for having a sizable Muslim population, which was by no means contraindicative of wine production or consumption. The region was ceded to Russia in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in wars with the Ottoman Empire. It was not fully pacified until long after that. Now, crown estates like Abraudorsu were places where the latest in vinicultural and enological expertise could be found. They were often the first places in their regions where vineyards were trellised, where European varietals were planted, where ancillary blooms were removed in the spring, and where the resulting wines had sufficiently high alcohol contents to avoid spoilage, which tended to be around 11% by volume. Crown estates employed Western vintners or Russian vintners who had trained abroad. The chief vintner at the Crown Estate in Sinandali in eastern Georgia was Italian by origin. He provoked a minor brouhaha around the turn of the century when he refused to authorize for sale in the British market wine that he knew to be flawed. So brand protection and reputation as vintner mattered more than profit. The wine was turned into vinegar instead. Now, most important, the crown estates were emblematic of a type of wealthy man's viniculture that became common in the Russian South over the course of the 19th century. In Crimea, vinicultural patterns came to resemble those of Bordeaux, where wine from a famous chateau might fetch several times the price per volume as wine from neighboring peasant villages. In Crimea, Russian wealth and non-Russian poverty existed side by side. Dozens of vinicultural estates were built over the course of the 19th century by many of the empire's most famous aristocratic families. In the hills outside the naval base at Sevastopol, viniculture became a popular pastime for high-ranking military officers. There were foreign colonists, often many generations removed from their homelands, who cultivated grapes. There were foreigners in the service of the Tsar who cultivated grapes, and even just foreigners who saw in Crimea, in Moldova, or Bessarabia, as it was called in Tsarist times, and other places in the South, a good business opportunity. By the end of the 19th century, there was even a tongue-in-cheek guidebook for wealthy persons who aspired to be viniculturalists in Crimea. It warned that life on a vinicultural estate was a far cry from the posh vacation culture of Yalta. Now, wealthy vineyard estates, with their modern modes of production, became a convenient foil for the backwardness of indigenous viniculture. There were Crimean Tatars who were impervious to even the most well-intentioned advice from the imperial newcomers. There were Kahetian peasants who saw wine not as a civilizational marker, but as an unpretentious staple of their daily diets. And there were Moldovan peasants who, according to some sarcastic 19th century wordplay, were the only ones who might taste in their wines, quote, the sweet fruits of their own labor. Yet indigenous viniculture also spoke to instabilities in the empire of the Tsars. Across the South, from Bessarabia in the West to Georgia in the East, viniculture had roots that predated the Russian encounter by many millennia. Georgia claims today to be the place where humans first mastered the grape, 6,000 years before the Common Era. Winemaking is scarcely younger in Crimea and Bessarabia. In Russia, wine's roots are shallow by comparison, although wine was present in Kievan Rus because of trading routes that linked the Dnieper Basin with Greek civilization at Constantinople and with non-Slavic communities along the Black Sea. Wine mostly disappeared until the 17th century, as East Slavic civilization shifted north and east. Even the wine of the Eucharist is difficult to trace during the Mongol period. It probably came from the Rhine via Novgorod or Arkhangelsk, but it's difficult to be certain. During the Petrine period, wine production and consumption were identified as European characteristics, part of that great transformation of the Russian gentry that Peter initiated. Mikhail Pogodin, the great 19th century critic of the Petrine reforms, famously wrote that Peter's corruption ranged from calendar to wardrobe, from language to table setting, from civil rank to canal dredging. And even the wine reminds us of Peter, for we had no wine before him. Now, the juxtaposition of indigenous experience with Russian non-experience in winemaking has implications for the way we understand the Russian imperial project. It suggests that the science of viniculture and winemaking in the Russian Empire was often compensatory. It helped right imperial hierarchies that had been turned on their head by the ubiquity and depth of vinicultural experience and expertise in the borderlands. Nathaniel Knight has argued that Russia, by offering what he calls an awkward triptych, Europe, Russia, and Asia, Russia confounds the stark dichotomy between Orient and Occident, upon which the analysis of Edward Said and many others hinge. The story of Russian winemaking further complicates these divisions by adding a second category in between East and West: European or Europeanized subjects of the empire. The non-Russian peoples of the South, with their long-standing and deeply entrenched wine traditions, had a claim on one aspect of Europeanness that the core of the empire lacked. To borrow Lenin's famous question, "Kto kogo?" Who whom? When it came to winemaking in the borderlands, who was acculturating whom? A vinicultural science of European origin and Russian transition made it possible for the imperial newcomers to the region to answer this question. Now, my third arc is drawn from those bandits who threatened to shoot Frolov Bagreyev. They were hungry workers from nearby Novorossiysk. For them, a crown estate was too tempting a target to pass up. Wine offered immediate relief in the form of drunkenness, but it could also be used as a form of currency to purchase food. Even the Abrau Dorsu workers later traded the wine they produced for flour that came from the American famine relief. And similar scenes were playing out across the fragmenting Russian Empire in 1919, as they had at other moments of societal duress, such as the revolution of 1905, and even the Pugachev rebellion in the 1770s. In Crimea, aristocratic families tried to evacuate the contents of their wine cellars before they could be looted by the advancing Red Army. The Golitsyn family shipped 20,000 bottles to Paris from the port at Feodosia. General Wrangel's military government saw wine as an important asset that could be used to fund continued struggle at home or resettlement abroad. It sent commercial envoys to Paris and London, hoping to profit one last time from foreign demand for Crimean wine. In St. Petersburg, the wine cellar at the Winter Palace was looted soon after the palace was seized. It was one of the largest private cellars in the world. The wine that wasn't consumed or destroyed in the cellar was carried outside, producing something that resembled a battlefield. Drunken workers and soldiers, prostrate and unmoving. A less ignominious fate befell Matilda Kashinskaya's cellar. She was the prima ballerina absoluta at the Mariinsky and Nicholas II's lover before his marriage. She often hosted dinners for fellow connoisseurs in her cellar. Her cellar appears to have fallen into the hands of Alexandra Kollontai, who moved into Kashinskaya's home shortly after Kashinskaya went into hiding in the summer of 1917. Now, whether or not these stories about wine mayhem are true is less important than the fact that they were told. The soldiers who seized the Winter Palace on that fateful night in October 1917 lacked the sophistication and erudition to appreciate the wines that they drunkenly guzzled. All the misfortune that befell Russia in subsequent years could be foreseen at that moment. Now, this elite hand-wringing about wine mayhem reflected a long tradition of wine writing in Tsarist Russia that survived to the end of the Soviet period. From almost the moment commercial wineries in Crimea and elsewhere began to produce high-quality wine for the domestic marketplace, vintners complained about the lowbrow tastes of the street. Contrary to the aristocracy, the burgeoning Russian middle class did not care for wine made in the European fashion. It instead preferred sweetened and fortified concoctions that merchants blended in their storage facilities. Vintners commonly referred to these concoctions as falsified wines. Some bore more than a passing resemblance to Benedict Erefeyev's famously drunken recipe for Tear of a Komsomol Girl. An 1885 guidebook for merchants described, without irony or shame, how to create a fake Malaga elegant by mixing communion wine, rum, a cypress-flavored liqueur, prunes, Chinese cinnamon, and the seeds of a marshmallow plant. Now, concern about falsified wine was behind Russia's short-lived wine purity law, which Nicholas II signed into effect in April 1914. Not a good time for new legislation. By the 1960s and 70s, virtually all Soviet wine was falsified wine. It was sweetened with beet sugar and strengthened with grain alcohol until it was about half-strength vodka. Sold under the labels Maritime, Aroma of the Steppe, or 777, it was referred to in slang as barmatuka, something that makes one mumble. Barmatuka accounted for about 90% of all Soviet wine production, a huge amount given the fact that the Soviet Union had become either the third or fourth largest producer of wine by volume in the world, trailing only France, Italy, and maybe Spain. Barmatuka was the bane of the pretentious classes. While there was no literature of connoisseurship in the Soviet Union, nothing for sure resembling Wine Spectator, the cultural press could be counted on for an article every year or two extolling the sublime characteristics of fine wine and excoriating the lowbrow tastes of the masses. Dripping in snobbery, these articles diverged hardly at all from the elitist elegies to the fine wines that perished in St. Petersburg in October 1917, or Odessa in 1905. The Soviet civilizing process had failed in regard to wine. Even at the end of the Soviet period, the vast majority of consumers preferred the swill of old. But so too had the Soviet anti-snobbery project run aground. A small minority of self-described connoisseurs, the diplomats and cultural figures who purchased wine on trips abroad, and anyone with special access to the stores that occasionally stocked Burgundies and Tokais, could not help but look with scorn on Barmatuka and the people who drank it. It was class pretentiousness disguised as wine snobbery. So my final arc brings us briefly to the present. So today, Abrau Dursu, the winery that was looted in 1919, is one of the largest wine manufacturers in Russia. In 2020, it produced 41 million bottles. What is that, about 3.5 million cases? And this would by point of comparison, would make it a medium-sized American producer. The chief vintner at Abrau Dursu today is French. His name is Georges Blanc. He's no relation to the famous chef by the same name. And the original winery that was ransacked in 1919 has been transformed into a tourist destination, not unlike the wineries in Napa with their faux Mediterranean ambiances. There's even a luxury hotel at Abrau Dursu where guests can take in spa treatments and yoga classes before wine tasting. Now, if you visit Abrau Dursu's website, you'll find a 15-minute video complete with English subtitles that dramatizes in mystical and patriotic ways many of the persons and events I have mentioned today. Frolov Bagreyev, Civil War, royal family, crown estate. So as in the Tsarist and Soviet years, the wine culture that Abrau Dursu embodies remains aspirational. It is unmistakably elitist and misleadingly artisanal in its self-presentation. But it has also been deracinated in its present Putinist form, shorn of its mixed 19th century parentage in the empire's multi-ethnic periphery. Okay, that's all I got.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve, for that interesting presentation. We already have a first question. I'd just like to remind everyone in attendance, if you do have a question for Dr. Bittner, go ahead and indicate that in the chat. Either type out the entire question and I'll read it on your behalf, or just indicate that you're interested in asking the question yourself and I'll call on you in the proper order. So the first question comes from Carl Quall. So I'll go ahead and hand the stage over to Carl.
Fascinating. I can't wait to read the book, Steve. I mean, it sounds really great, and it reminds me of One Too Many Falsified Wines in Sevastopol in the 90s. I'm not sure if that's a good memory or a bad memory. I like the idea, kind of the imperial project and all the different types of people that were making wines in the Russian Empire. I wonder if you came across anything about Karaite Jews in the Crimea running their own wineries or working with Tatars, Russians, or anyone else.
Yeah, a little bit. In fact, in your corner of Crimea, up in the, what is it, the Alma Valley, I think there was either when at the moment of annexation, there was either the remnants of a Karaite community or just the archaeological remains of one. And they were had some fairly elaborate irrigation infrastructure that they had constructed, which was I mean, the Russians, at the moment of annexation, those first couple decades, the Russians were collating and counting and compiling just about everything. And so they would create these kind of hierarchies of vinicultural expertise. And at the bottom in Crimea, of course, were the Tatars. And then above the Tatars were the Greeks, the Karaites, there were some, I think, Genoans there as well. And then, of course, at the top were the Russians with their European expertise. So I have a little bit on them, but not very much. I think kind of more interesting is, whether any of the wine that these people made was very good. And there was a very prolific wine writer at the end of the 19th century who kind of suggested in devious ways that some of these people actually really made good wine. And what he was doing, in a sense, was playing around with the idea of terroir without actually using that as a conceptual device. And he was saying these people have kind of mastered the difficulty of their specific microclimates over many, many years. And they produce good wine despite the fact that they lack any modern modes of production or viniculture. And that was another way that kind of imperial hierarchies were turned on their head in the vinicultural belt.
Great, thank you.
All right, so next we have a question from Suk-Young Kim, who writes, thanks for the interesting presentation. I would like to know a bit more about sommeliers in Imperial Russia. Did they form a distinctive professional group? Were they mostly foreigners?
Yeah, so this falls into the category of topics that I looked into and drew mostly a blank on who the sommeliers were. The ones I came across tended to be foreigners. In fact, they tended, in every case I know of, they were French. But there were, among the Russian aristocracy in the 19th century, wine. Knowledge about wine was something that it was just expected that you bring into high polish. It's like proper French pronunciation. Herzen actually writes about this in his memoir about, experimenting with wine as a young man. And so among that kind of very narrow slice at the top of Russian society, wine knowledge was pretty widespread. Yuri Lotman also has written about this, the elite dining practices in St. Petersburg. And there are some direct parallels here, I think, with Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin. Onegin, there's a famous scene in Onegin where he and Lenski, it's right after they first meet, and they're lying on the floor in front of the fire in Onegin's ancestral home. And Lenski is drinking champagne, French champagne. And Onegin kind of comments to himself how this is a simple man's pleasure, and that Onegin himself prefers the more complex wines of Bordeaux. And so you can see how, both Lenski and Onegin are Westerners, Europeans, in the way that word was understood in 19th century Russia. But Pushkin is using wine to delineate very precise gradations of social status. And so Onegin is the world-weary, pretentious wine connoisseur. And Lenski, who has a degree from a German university, is more primitive in his his wine desires.
All right, thanks for that response. Next, we have a question from Matthew Lungerhausen, if I'm pronouncing that last name correct. And he asks, so is contemporary Abro Dirsu any good?
Often when I, over the years, as I've given talks on this as a work in progress, I've led wine tastings. And so I've done this at Georgetown and at University of Wisconsin, and most recently, right before COVID, at the University of Illinois. And so the first thing I'm obligated to say is that the central insight in the scholarship on taste, from Kant to Levi-Strauss, is that taste is subjective, right? And so, to some extent, that renders an answer to the question impossible. The Russian palate tends to be a little bit sweeter than the American palate, or certainly the French palate. And so on that last slide I showed, there's a photo of a bottle of Abrau Dorsu, and it's labeled red semi-sweet. And what the Russians considered to be semi-sweet, halbsus, would be for our palate very sweet, too sweet for most of us, I think. So if it's good, it's good wine designed for made for people with different palates.
All right, very good. I'm going to kind of bundle the next two questions into one, which have to do with source materials. So Robert Edelman asked, can Steve talk more about his sources and where they were found? And this was echoed by Kelly Kolar, who says, I noticed that some of the photographs were from the Library of Congress and NYPL. I imagine this must have been a diverse source set, and I would also like to hear a bit more about it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll speak first about. Well, let me say hi to Kelly. Kelly, I'm happy you're here. So let me speak first about the work I did over there. So I did. I made my first trip to Russia on this project. I think it was the summer of 2009, and I went to Crimea. And then I found enough there that I thought maybe there was an article in this. I wasn't sure how much time I was going to devote to it, but I just kept every summer and every intercession I would go back. And so I ended up doing archival work in Georgia, in Tbilisi, in Crimea, in Simferopol, in Yalta, in Odessa, which was a really fruitful excursion. I went there several times, in Kiev, and in Moscow. And so the big thing I've left out there is St. Petersburg. I looked there and I just didn't find enough to merit the time. And so that was principally archival work, with one exception. In Simferopol, there's this, which was the kind of capital of Crimea, is the capital of Crimea. There's this place called Museum of Tauride, the Tauride Museum. And they just had this fantastic old book collection. And so a lot of my 19th century work, which is the first 3 chapters of the book, were done in this library. And they were very generous with letting me photograph things. Now, Kelly's brought up the stuff from, the stuff from NYPL and LOC. I had actually had planned a trip to Library of Congress in March of 2020. And it literally, the Monday I was going to arrive was the Monday the reading room at LOC closed because of COVID. And the purpose of my trip was to gather illustrations. And so as it turned out, I was only able to gather illustrations from LOC and NYPL that I could find online. So I'm really generous that Prokudin-Gorsky collection has been digitized, because I have a couple illustrations from that in my book. And the NYPL, I found it less rich than Library of Congress, but I also drew a couple of illustrations from that. And then a lot of the illustrations in the book are just things that, photographs that I had taken, and photographs of wine labels. But insofar as the book has a COVID weakness, it is the illustrations, it was my intention to have more, and it's just something I had unwisely saved until the end, and then epidemic got in the way.
Well, I have a feeling, just to make the note of it, that that's probably a universal experience for people writing monographs. The illustrations come probably within weeks of finalizing the manuscript and sending it off to the editor. So that I don't think you're out of the ordinary there. All right, so next we have a question from Lisa Jacobson, who I should point out is also working on a history of alcohol, but in 20th century America. And she asks, just curious, how has wine been incorporated into Russian restaurant culture?
You mean, and I assume that the question is post-Soviet Russia. So interestingly here, the Barmatuka has disappeared. It just seems that Barmatuka could not withstand the sort of opening of Russia to the outside world, Moscow, I mean, a lot of my Russianist colleagues will know Moscow now has several of the very best restaurants in the world, and you can spend a lot of money there. And a lot of these restaurants have really highbrow wine, wine collections that they're happy to let you browse. But young people, in a world where young people can pull up the latest Robert Parker reviews of the Bordeaux vintages on their iPhones, and where they can travel for kind of Epicurean weekends to Tuscany or to France, it's just Bordeaux or Barmatuka could not survive that, and I think that that is indicative, I think, of the power of the capitalist civilizing project. That the Soviet state used all the tools at its disposal to create a culture of fine wine in the 1930s and 40s, and they failed. They could not wean Russian or Soviet consumers from these sweetened and strengthened wines. And now they've disappeared almost entirely. I see Steve Marks is here. I'm doing something with Steve in a couple of weeks, and he was going to purchase some wines for the event. And I said, oh, it'd be great if you could get a bottle of Barmatuka. But of course, it's impossible to find Barmatuka anymore. In fact, it's a slang word. It's just disappeared entirely from the universe.
All right, great. Before I turn to, and Steve's question, Steve Marks' question is the next in the order. Before I turn to that question, I wanted to just briefly return to the comments you were making about sources and locations for research. I know you talked about, at least here in the States, you talked about the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress. But myself carrying out a book-length project on the history of wine in fascist Italy, I have found UC Davis, their viticultural library, to actually be really useful. They have a lot of Italian sources there that I've borrowed and have been really critical for my research. So I'm wondering, do they have like a dearth of Russian sources there, or have you found anything of use?
Oh, well, to the contrary. So yeah, I was remiss in not mentioning Davis, and the largest specifically collection of wine materials in the Western Hemisphere is at University of California at Davis, and the wine librarian there, Axel Borg, is just a national treasure. In fact, I have one chapter in the book about a professor at UC Davis who took several sabbatical trips to Russia as scholar, and then as connoisseur, and then as representative of Pepsi Corporation, which had opened up a bottling plant in Novorossiysk and was trying to figure out how to repatriate its its ruble-denominated profits. And so it actually toyed around with the idea of importing Soviet wine back into the United States. This is actually the way that Stolichnaya vodka comes to America. It's through this Pepsi investment there. And so, you know, without question, that facilitated my proximity to Davis, facilitated this project. I also, I'll just point out, you know, I also made a trip to Ithaca, New York. Cornell is kind of the Davis of the East Coast, you know, up in the Finger Lakes wine country. And there was a person who I had encountered. His name was Konstantin Frank, who was a Volksdeutsch. And worked in interwar Georgia as a vintner, and was in Odessa during German-Romanian occupation. And certainly as a privileged Volksdeutsch, he would have witnessed atrocity there. And when you know, Odessa fell to the Red Army, he fled west, and he ended up in the American zone in Austria. And then he ended up at the Cornell Agricultural Extension Station in Geneva, New York. And he actually carried out an entire set of books that were of interest to me, and they're exceedingly rare. It's called Vinadelia Vrasi. And it's a 6-volume set. And as far as I know, UCLA had one copy. Harvard University had the entire set at the Wittner Library, but they were checked out. And the New York Botanical Garden had a set, but they were all bound. They were bound. 6 volumes were bound together, and they said they wouldn't let me use it because they were afraid I would crack the binding. And so, process of elimination meant I traveled to Ithaca, New York a couple of years ago to take a look at these.
Wow, fascinating. All right, I'm glad that UC Davis was of use to you. All right, so next in line we have Steve Marks. He says, I was wondering, and there's kind of a 2-point question here. 1, if there was a market for the wine cellars of ex-aristocratic estates in the NEP, and 2, can you speak to Jewish kosher wine production in the Pale of Settlement? Where did Russian Jews make or get their wines?
Okay, so first of all, you know, the expropriation of wines from private wine cellars, yeah, for sure, that happened, and those are some really interesting documents to read. You know, I came across those at RGE, the Russian State Economics Archive. And interestingly, a lot of these wine cosmopolitans whom I spoke about at the beginning of my talk, they were called in the 1920s to conduct a degustatia, a tasting, to assign prices to these wines. And I mean, I've never seen such a collection of treasures mentioned in one place. I mean, there were, you know, tens of thousands of bottles of Chateau Lafite and Haut-Brion, and, you know, just every possible wine treasure you can imagine, with vintages stretching back to the, you know, the 1870s and the 1880s. And these people had to give them a price for the net marketplace. And so I think that suggests a couple of things. It suggests, first of all, that the Bolsheviks knew that this was an item of value. It was not an interchangeable commodity. And it also suggests, interestingly, that there were no great wine bargains to be had in Moscow and in Leningrad during NEP, right? Because everything was priced appropriately to what connoisseurs had determined to be fair. So that's the answer to your first question. Your second question, you know, the wine of the shtetl. This is even more difficult, I think, to trace, or was more difficult for me to trace than the wine of the Eucharist in Russia, except that, you know, most the lands of Poland and eastern or western Ukraine, Belarusia, you know, these were kind of outside of that kind of place where, East Slavic civilization migrated after 1237. And so, as far as we can tell, the first grapes that were planted at Izmailovsky outside of Moscow in the 17th century actually came from a Ukrainian monastery. And so it seems like though Vitis vinifera disappeared from what would become Russian civilization, it was present in territories farther to the west. These territories, of course, that would become part of the Pale of Settlement. And so I assume that means that wine was, or grapes were not so rare there. But in the archival 19th century archival documents, kosher wine is always treated as a separate category entirely. I mean, there's kosher wine and then there's church wine.
All right, very good. Next is just a comment here, an offer actually from Carl Qualls. He says, I still have a 96 Massandra if you want it, probably vinegary by now. All right, next in line is Steve Estes. Hello to Steve Estes. The question is, to what extent is the deeper multi-ethnic story of wine from the imperial Soviet borderlands now being deployed for nationalist purposes by former Soviet republics?
Yeah, so the answer is it is a weapon, in the lead up to the war in the Caucasus in 2006, Russia banned, or 2008, Russia banned Georgian and Moldovan wine, and the reason was completely contrived. It was they said there were pesticides, traces of pesticides in the wine. Never mind the fact that most Georgian and Moldovan producers were too poor to afford pesticides. But those were Russia was the biggest export marketplace for both Moldova and Georgia. And so it was a way of kind of striking back. It came right at a time where Moldova was seeking an association agreement with the European Union, and right after the so-called Rose Revolution, that brought Mikhail Saakashvili to power in Georgia, who was Columbia educated and friendly with all the Republican neocons. And then it didn't help when, after the ban was enacted, that the Minister of Defense in Georgia said that, oh, it doesn't matter. We always exported to Russia our worst stuff because the Russians will consume, quote, even fecal material. So each side was kind of using wine as a weapon, against the other side. But, the territory around Abrau Dorsu, the indigenous roots of winemaking have been, eluded. That's not part of the story. And, I highly encourage you to go to the website and watch this video. And, there's no mention of the fact that wine has existed for millennia in this part of the world. It's something that Russia built.
All right, very good. We have time, I believe, just enough time, perhaps, for the final two questions. I know it's 1 till, and I want to be timely here, but we do have 2 more questions. We'll see if we can get through them. The first one comes from Randall Clark. He says, please detail the transition period from Soviet collectives to the current privatized wine business.
Yeah, so that's a big question. That would take a very long response. But let me just say that the Crown Estates in 1918, the Crown Estates all become savkhozy, state farms, and then so what happens to these savkhozy in 1991? Well, it depends where you are. They have a different fate in Crimea than they do in Russia. One of the big problems in Crimea has been the migration of viniculture away from the southern shore since 1991. And this is simply a product of the rising real estate values, that vineyards are being torn out and luxury mansions are going in. And even today, Massandra sources most of its grapes from Bulgaria and Macedonia. So, you know, in the Soviet era, advertising slogan was Massandra, bottled Crimean sunshine. But that's not true anymore, because those are, for the most part, not Crimean grapes anymore. And if they are coming from Crimea, they're coming from the less prestigious steppe vineyards north of Simferopol. You know, the Crimean topography is such that there's this mountain range right along the southern shore that kind of drops really precipitously and dramatically into the ocean. And it's in those valleys where, you know, you get these very small microclimates. But if you go north of that, just 20 miles to the north, you're out on the open steppe, and you have that continental climate, which makes viniculture much more difficult. So the future of Crimean viniculture is at this moment very, very uncertain.
All right, I think we have time perhaps for a short response to, I think, a question that could probably be responded to shortly. The question is from Jared Bateman, and it is, was an underground market created for Moldovan wine when Russia banned it in 2013?
Yeah, so I write a little about this just in the conclusion. There was some sort of criminal conspiracy that for a couple of weeks was the outrage of the moment in Russia, where an Orthodox monastery in, was it Ekaterinburg, was continued to import wine from Moldova. And the wine they were importing was Kagor. It's what the Russians call it. It's Kahor is what we would call it, the wine in the style of a Kahor. And the wine was being brought into Russia in the personal car of the hegumen of the monastery. And so like very high up church officials were involved in this scheme. And then Moldova was exporting wine to Cyprus, and then from Cyprus importing the wine into Russia. And so even Moldova found a way around around this ban. But both Moldova and Georgia have sought Western markets for its wines. There's restaurants in San Francisco now, nice restaurants where you can find wine from Pheasant's Tears, which is kind of the highest of the highbrow Georgian producers. And they make wine in the traditional Georgian way in amphorae. And there was even a moment, it was probably 10 or 15 years ago, where it was rumored that Saakashvili was going to come to Sonoma State and speak at our wine business program. And for some reason that never materialized.
All right, it is 3 after, so I think we've run through the time that we've allotted. I want to, in closing and conclusion, thank Dr. Bittner for his time coming here today, sharing your research with us and engaging with us in this Q&A. But in closing, I want to acknowledge Dr. Bittner's role within my own research program. So as I was leaving Sonoma State, graduating with my bachelor's, moving on to my master's program, I heard from Steve that he was beginning this research project, and he even had the title at the time, Whites and Reds. It stuck with me because I thought it was such a fascinating topic. And I also left with an interest in totalitarianism. I kind of knew that I didn't want to learn Cyrillic and go in towards Soviet history, but I was interested in totalitarianism. I was interested in, having lived in Sonoma County along with you, in wine. And it was the combination of these things that I took from my time with Steve that snowballed into my dissertation project, and now my first book project, which is on winemaking in fascist Italy. So it's truly been a pleasure to be able to host the apex of this project, the publication and the promotion of it in this virtual book talk. So I thank you for your time and for your influence over the years.
Thanks, Brian. That's kind. And when your book comes out, I'll return the favor, and we'll do it in person.
That's good. It'll be a deal. All right. Thank you to you, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Stephen. Well
Bye.
done.